Welcome to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. I am Jasmine Perrin, an educational development and digital learning designer. This podcast is brought to you by Teaching and Academic Programs at McGill University, also known as TAP. We're recording today from Montreal, Quebec, on unceded land, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work on these lands. So welcome back to another episode of our fifth series, Teaching in the Era of Gen AI. I'm here with the co-host of this series, Adam Finkelstein, the Associate Director of Learning Environments. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Jasmine. Thanks again for a great intro. I mean, what a season it's been. We've been going all over the place from, talking with faculty about what they're doing and how they're integrating AI into their teaching and learning, and have just been in the middle of a great conversation with some associate provosts.
So we're about to dive into part 3 of this 3-part episode where we interviewed Associate and Vice Provosts of Teaching and Learning from 3 of Canada's leading universities, Professor Chris Buttle from McGill University, Dr. Simon Bates from the University of British Columbia, and Professor Susan McCann from the University of Toronto. So I think this 3rd episode is probably one of my favorite ones we've done so far. In this final part of our 3-part episode, we're really zooming out beyond courses and beyond institutions. Up to this point, we talked about opportunity, as you said, Adam, about challenges with assessments, with instructor support. But all of that kind of shapes something much bigger: how students imagine their futures beyond attending university. Students are paying very close attention to how quickly AI is changing their fields of work, and many are understandably anxious about what this means for their future careers.
Absolutely. And, one of the things about the future is that's where we're going to spend the rest of our lives. So I think that it's really appropriate to think about it in terms of, how is AI going to impact that future, and not only just impact, but what can we do to help guide it into the direction that we really want it to go. So in this episode, we're really going to ask that big question, is a university degree in a world where AI can generate, summarize, and evaluate knowledge? What is a university degree in that kind of world, and what does it mean?
So let's jump back into the conversation. So I do have one last question, and for this one, I kind of want to zoom out beyond the university itself and more how it fits into our reality. Much of what we're discussing ultimately shapes how students imagine their futures, and students have reported concerns around the future of their work. AI can now generate, summarize, and even evaluate knowledge, and it's moving so quickly, while universities, as we know, move quite slow. So how should universities address student concerns and prepare students for a job market where AI will reshape, or in some cases even eliminate, many of the traditional jobs that we were once trying to prepare them for when they graduate?
Yeah, I can have a stab at this one. This really is zooming out. We're basically asking, what's a university for? What's a university degree? A couple of years ago, I had the real privilege of working with Danny Liu from the University of Sydney, educational technology professor. We worked together on a project, and he had this wonderful way of describing what students need from a degree. And it's really, really simple, which is why it stuck with me. It's stuff, skills, and soul. And just to unpack those, stuff is easy. That's content. We've been doing that forever, right? Content in the advanced stages of a discipline, in many cases at the frontiers of a discipline. Universities have been doing that forever. Skills, I think over my career and time in higher education, there has been much more of an explicit focus on the skills that students develop during their degrees, making them visible, not having them as part of an implicit curriculum, but actually foregrounding it. You will see this in course learning outcomes, in program learning outcomes. But I think soul is about ways of being or ways of becoming. These are the sort of affective components: resilience, working with ambiguity, working with others, working with different perspectives, intercultural competencies. The irony of it is, in an era of AI, we're talking about the importance of distinctly human skills. And I think that's really important, because that's not something that can currently be replaced by machines. And I hope it never is, because learning is a human and social process at its heart. So I think that's what we need to do for our students. We need to help them become. We need to foreground some of those ways of being in courses and in the outcomes of courses. And in doing that, I think that has huge implications for faculty development as well, because I think faculty are very comfortable as subject matter experts. They may be well aware of broader or what sometimes erroneously gets called soft skills, because they're actually kind of important and not soft at all. But thinking about helping students who explicitly build resilience within your course design. How do you model and demonstrate empathy and compassion? How do you be a reflective educator? I think foregrounding some of those will help assuage some of the concerns that students have, that what is all of this for, given that the world is going to look very different in 4 or 5 years when I graduate.
Yeah, it's so interesting. This is part of the research that I do, is actually looking at the intersection between AI capabilities and engineering competencies to identify how we will want to adjust our curriculum to maintain relevancy for our graduates. I think one of the things that gets pointed out in that literature on AI job disruption quite a bit is that previous technology revolutions have not eliminated necessarily jobs, or there are very few types of jobs really that get completely eliminated. But what happens is the expectation of skills and quality of jobs goes up tremendously. So, from one of my colleagues in sociology that I love is when people introduced dishwashers and washing machines to save women time. It didn't. What it did was increased the expectations about how clean things were around your house, right? It didn't actually reduce the work of women at all. And as ATM machines came in, it hasn't eliminated, there are fewer perhaps bank tellers, but the bank tellers that we have are now expected to be able to do many more different things than just hand out cash. So it adds to the complexity. I'm really concerned about entry-level positions. I'm really concerned about the impact on that bridging between universities and jobs. Interestingly, past technology revolutions have not decreased the time in education, they've increased it. It went from you could get a decent job out of high school to you had to have an undergraduate degree to you have to have a graduate. Like, we are increasing the actual prep time necessary to take what will be an entry-level job, because technology tends to sort of mechanize away some of the things like bank teller positions that kids would have gotten as a summer job in high school back in the day. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about a lot, is I think we need those skills like ever more. We used to use shortcuts. When I got a set of drawings, right? I'm old enough that when I was in engineering, you took your sketches down to a draftsman. The draftsman drafted them for you, and then you had to check the drawings, right? And then there was the era of CAD where I did the drawings myself. And so I could rely on them because I did the drawings. And I could rely on my draftsman because I got to know which were the good draftsmen, which were the ones that I needed to check a little bit more carefully, etc. You hand something to AI to do, and the level of checking that you're going to need to do goes up tremendously. We're losing a lot of the sort of proxies we have for, as Simon put it, interpretability or trustworthiness in some of this technology by handing these things off. And so as that trustworthiness, whether it's photos and videos and this information, or whether that's work that the AI is doing to do data interpretation or make decisions about mortgages and health coverage or whatever else, the skills of our students need in order to be really critical consumers and managers of these technologies goes up as well. And so I think it's actually going to amp up the kind of critical thinking and judgment skills that our students need, because so many of the proxies we have for reliability, whether that's in cover letters and letters of recommendation or what we see on the news or what we read in papers and research papers, I can't just look at the author anymore and say, that came from so-and-so, therefore it is a good piece of research work, right? Many of these sort of shortcuts we have for credibility are getting undermined. And that's going to change the expectations of what students need going into jobs.
One of the things I've been thinking about is the importance of universities continuing to offer diverse kinds of educational opportunities and programs and areas of study. And because we're not going to be in a position to predict what is going to be important in 5 years relative to what is important today. And, a philosopher today versus a philosopher 200 years ago is very different. Important in different ways. Same with engineering. So you pick your discipline. So I think having a recognition of the importance of a diversity of approaches, pedagogical competencies, deep learning skills, is going to be so important as we go forward. And I think I too worry about the entry level positions, Susan, that you mentioned, and I also worry about the older workforce who have questions about retraining and are losing jobs. And what is the role of universities in supporting across a real range of career stages is a really interesting question that we'll also be able to reflect on. So it is exciting. It's scary, but I also think we've talked so much today about I think the opportunities are more than the negatives, if I'm to be honest, when I think about how we can position ourselves to really answer society's call at large. I think we can. We need to be maybe a little more nimble than we sometimes are, but also remain diverse in our approaches is going to be really important.
So this brings the conversation with our guests to a close. I feel like this has been an insightful and well-articulated conversation that's probably relevant to anybody and everybody in the higher ed sphere. As we wrap up the final episode, we can see here over the last 3 parts of this episode is that there's a lot of concern about jobs, a lot of concern about the transitions around workload and change, maybe even trust, but also a very strong sense that the role of universities may actually become more important and not less important in the future. And across the progression of the 3 episodes, we moved from discussing opportunities to tensions to purpose. And the message that carries through that is that in an AI-mediated world, human judgment, our ability to adapt, the ethical considerations, and the relationships that we have with each other are now more important than ever. Adam, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant, Jasmine, thinking about the opportunity, tension, and purpose. And I think it goes back to this, the whole idea is, we were past the concept of thinking about if we're going to have to deal with AI. It's really, now we're really talking about like, well, how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to sort of create and navigate this really complex relationship with a technology that we're still struggling to understand? And I come back to, Tim Creasy from ProSci has a really interesting framework to think that through. And he talks about, 3 different kind of buckets that we have to think about with our relationship with AI and in a way to integrate it into our lives. And he thinks about it in the 3 different ways. The first being, what's going to be my work? What is the work that I need to do by myself, like the human exclusive kind of work? That's a really important thought and something we've really heard a lot about in this episode. But the other 2 buckets we also have to really think about, which is, what am I going to automate with AI? What do I want AI to do for me? And how can I get a way to get out of it and get AI to do that kind of task. And then of course the biggest issue, which is, how am I going to, think through the AI collaboration opportunities? What am I going to do to help think through, what is AI going to do with me? And I think that's going to be the real challenge that we're all going to be faced with in redefining our professions and redefining our disciplines. What is the work I need to do? What is the work that I'm going to outsource to AI? And then what am I going to do with AI? And that's a struggle. I think that, there's a further element of this that makes it really, really difficult. And that, when we're thinking about this in terms of our own profession, we're experts. And I think that's one of the things that we often forget, especially as people working at universities and faculty members, that we're experts in our domain. So we've gone through all of the cognitive struggle and the learning process to get to that level of expertise, where now we can sort of decide, oh, great, we have this thing called AI and it can outsource a whole bunch of work that we don't have to do anymore, which we are grateful for. It's fantastic for us. One of the real big questions is, well, what about our students and what about our children? How do we figure out what they need to struggle with and what they don't? And, it really gets back to the core question, which is, what do we want students to know? What are the learning outcomes that we have, and what are the different ways we can get there? And now AI is providing even more opportunities and more different ways to get to our learning outcomes that we've really never even begun to think about. And I think that's going to be one of those key struggles that we're going to have to be wrestling with in education when it comes to what is our university all about.
Yeah, I hear you. This is an important aspect to consider in this part of this transition. Even as a faculty member or even as support, we're in a place of using these tools to help us professionally, but we've gone through the hardships of learning and the cognitive struggles. So we kind of have to keep that at the forefront when reflecting on how to guide students through this massive change in higher ed. And in part 3 of this episode, the thing that struck me the most was Simon's framework. So stuff, skills, and soul. And I think I really loved this part of the conversation because we addressed purpose, which is something that I think about a lot. And I think I participate, in a lot of metacognitive reflections in my own life in general. I think it's important to remember what's at the heart of what we're doing. So the framework was kind of like a ding moment in my mind, like, yes, of course, this is it. And there's something so interesting in that framework with how it relates to the future of higher ed in a world where AI is so pervasive. The stuff is, what we often focus on because it's more straightforward, it's more tangible to assess, like what do my students know? But the skills and even more the soul are outcomes that are more affective and more difficult to capture in a way. And for anybody who's ever tried to come up with affective learning outcomes knows that it's a challenge. But knowing this, I'm happy to hear the perspectives that these outcomes remain a little more untouchable by AI and will perhaps become even more important in the future. So this kind of gives me a more realistic vision of what the future holds for higher ed. And, it can be scary to think about what the future is going to look like because it's very, very different from anything that we've ever experienced before. And so, Adam knows this story and often brings it up to me. We were at a conference last spring, and we went to this keynote that was discussing the future of AI. It wasn't necessarily education related, but more generally talking about the mere speed that things are moving at and what the near future holds. And it was safe to say quite alarming for me. I felt extremely destabilized. And so after that session, I made a comment to my team, like, I need to go outside and lay in a field and touch some grass right now because I feel very ungrounded and am currently holding on to this very dystopian view of what the future may look like. And I think that it was just me getting caught up in that hype cycle of what we talked about earlier. It can be very scary when you can't really fathom what reality or that day-to-day will be in our personal lives or in our professional lives and so on. But this conversation we had to produce over these last 3 episodes really made me feel grounded in a way that I can sort of maybe picture what the future is going to look like. And it's not going to be so bad if we progress with intent and with thoughtfulness and transparency and so on. So I like to believe that higher ed is quite good at doing that. So I think and I hope, we're in good hands.
It's funny how, people who study history are considered historians and extremely revered and authoritative. People who study the future are generally considered a little bit out there and science fiction and it's things that are made up and not real. But there really is a study of the future that's important. And like I said earlier, it's like future is where we're going to spend the rest of our lives. So we really have a really good idea of what it's going to look like. It doesn't mean we can predict it, but we definitely can study it and we can think about what are the possible futures that lead us towards a positive direction. And I think that's what you're talking about, this idea of, not falling into the dystopian spiral because we fall into a dystopian spiral because we can't see the positive future possibilities. And that often happens when we see new technologies that are frightening, or do things that we've never seen before. And it's sort of like, oh my God, I can't believe that I can do this. And, I sat down the other day with AI and was using some of the deep research tools. And it's, I just had to step back for a minute and go, I cannot believe that we can do this. It's incredible that we can sit down and have a conversation with a technology and be able to produce stuff that is of such high quality. You never would have thought that. And it's incredible to think that we can do these kind of things. And I think that's really the challenge, is taking that incredible sort of like, oh my goodness, what have we got here? And using that sense of wonder in a positive way to think about like, well, what can we do with this in education? Like, how can this change not just like the way we do business day to day, but how can we fundamentally shift around our university structures, our education structures, and think about a better way of doing business, and that helping students become masters within the disciplines that we're trying to teach them. And I think that that's really the challenge, is we at universities have to start really being creative about how can we use these technologies in those ways? What can we do differently with this? And, not just like, let's make a better test. It's like, how can we rethink assessment from the ground up? How can we think about content in a different way? What can we think about courses differently? Can courses be created on the fly? Can we use AI to build them? All these sort of ideas, I think, are what's bouncing around in my head and a number of others on our teams, thinking about, this is super exciting. And I, for one, am very excited because I think, this is where we're going to spend the rest of our careers. And boy, is it going to be interesting.
Yeah, it's already very interesting, and it will continue to be interesting, I'm sure. On that note, I think we'll wrap up. I will say, I'm very grateful to have been a part of this conversation. It's been fascinating watching our leaders lead and being able to, be in the room and hear their thoughts of pushing forward and how they're guiding us. So I really appreciate this a lot. And I want to thank Chris, Susan, and Simon for giving us their time, for letting us record them and be a part of this podcast. So thank you to you three, and thanks, Adam, for being a part of the conversation as well. I hope that over all of these conversations, the last 3 episodes, and even, the ones before in this series, we hope that it sparked reflection and conversations within your own networks, within your own teaching and learning context. So thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. Please subscribe to Teach, Learn, Share, and let others know about it. Until next time.